So I want to say welcome to everybody to a Well Done Professional Midlife podcast. And I am very excited. Today I have one of my favorite leaders. I have Dave Kievet, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Boldt Construction. So welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Sharon. Good to be here.
Yeah, so you've been with Boldt a long time, 20 plus years that you've been with that organization. And in 2008, you recently moved into your role, your current role of Chief Operating Officer. So why don't we start by having you tell the listeners what have been some of the biggest learnings that you've had sort of along that path of starting as a young man at Boldt and then working your way through all the different layers that you have to become Chief Operating Officer?
Sure. So I'd have to say that one of the biggest differences is making the switch from being a manager to a leader. I think that working in the construction industry, I was for most of all of my career, I thought I was a pretty good project manager. I think I planned out the details of the project pretty well. You know, I directed people, I set objectives, I drove towards the targets, and by all acceptable measures, I think I was successful in doing that. This worked for me as I managed to kind of move up in the organization. I thought that as I began to climb, I would use these same skills that have served me so well in managing projects. I would probably use those to manage people as well. And what I found out is that when I thought that I would have more control, I actually had less. And in fact, those skills and those practices that I used to manage projects actually caused me to fail miserably as a leader. My ability to lead had more to do with my ability to influence than it did to drive projects. So trying to make that switch was a very difficult process for me. Being kind of an engineering mindset of understanding that it has more to do with the people than it has to do with the projects. And in fact, instead of building buildings for a career, I had to make the mind shift, I think, from building buildings to building people. I began to understand that I no longer needed to be the smartest person in a room. My job was to find the smartest person in the room and then help encourage them in order to accomplish what we needed to accomplish. Now, maybe that comes naturally to some leaders, but it was a real difficult process for me. And over the years, as I watched developing managers come up through the organization, trying to make that switch from managing things to leading people is sometimes a difficult process. And I've seen more than a few people crash and burn at that transition stage. So that was probably one of the biggest lessons that I had learned.
Okay, so that's really interesting observation because, one of the things that I was probably the most excited about having you as a guest on the podcast is I think of you as one of the best people centric leaders that I've met. I think you do an amazing job. So, how did you make that transition, Dave? Did you have a mentor? Did you have an influencer who helped you to come to that realization and then also make that transition from a metrics driven, project management type driven leadership to becoming more that people centric servant leader that you are today?
I think one of probably the biggest things that helped me was I ran over too many people in my process. So I've always, practiced a lot of deep self-reflection and trying to understand what it was that I did today and how I could use that to create a better tomorrow. And I think that's probably one of the skills that had helped me the most. Is when I would run into one of these situations that probably didn't work out as well as it could have. I probably had a personality that was more inclined to think about what had happened and what I did to maybe cause that, and then what I could do differently tomorrow in order to change that. And it was through a series of incidents that caused me to focus and understand that it was really more about the people than it was about the project or the process. The other thing that had happened along the way is I used to have this deep-seated understanding that I could somehow separate who I was professionally from who I was personally. So for a long time, I thought I'd go to work, and when I walked in that door, I was, all business, and I was focused on the results and getting things done. And then I needed to go home and And I needed to be the dad, and I needed to be the husband, and I needed to be the friend. And what happened is I ended up running into conflicts on both sides of that equation, right? So I run into problems at work because I was viewed as being cold and uncaring. And then I would run into problems at home because I was viewed almost a little bit of the same way. And through a series of personal experiences, some which weren't all that much fun, I came to the realization that I'm the same person, and I am who I am both at home and I'm at work. And when I became comfortable with that, I think that it caused me maybe to be a little bit more authentic, made me realize that it was okay that in front of my employees, that it was okay to let my hair down a little bit. It was okay to let them know some of the things that I was struggling with, and that I didn't need to have all the answers, and I wasn't the smartest guy in the room. And I just had to be comfortable doing that, and being able to look out to them and have my employees understand that I needed them as much as they needed me. And it was when I began to understand that relationship a little bit better, that things began to work better than I thought that they could. And I began to understand, there's a kind of a big paradigm shift in the fact that, the more that I wanted to be seen as a leader, the more I had to let go. When in essence, I originally thought that the more control I had to maintain and the tighter grip I had to have on that whole situation was going to get me to where I wanted to be. The reality is the more that I let go of it and the more I began to trust other people and bring other people in, then the more success I began to experience. And then as I began to see that success, it began to build on itself, and it ended up coming to what I believe in today as far as the path forward.
That's such great insight. Part of what I talk about in the book, A Well Done Professional Midlife Crisis, is the fact that we are one person. And it is so imperative that you think about everything, not just from a professional standpoint, but really how the dynamics of how it impacts you from a personal standpoint as well. So that's very insightful for our listeners. I promised you this would not be a COVID 19 podcast, but I would be remiss to not at least ask you a couple questions. I think we're all tired of talking about COVID 19, but obviously it's changed the landscape of leadership, and it's certainly changed the landscape of the industry we live in construction. So, just share with me some of the dynamics maybe that have changed for you from a leadership perspective of leading through a crisis.
Well, I think that this whole COVID-19 crisis has probably accentuated the need for leadership more than it ever has. It's one thing to lead an organization when you can see and touch and speak to the people every day, but how do you lead an organization when you have to communicate via video conferences and over the telephone and you can't really see people face to face? That's been a real challenge. So I think that those practices that make for a good leader, I think in this COVID crisis, um, probably were needed, even more than ever. The ability to communicate with your employees and to communicate with the group, within the company, let them know what was going on a regular basis, what you were struggling with, so that they could feel like they were part of the organization and connected, so that they could still get their work done and that the feelings that they were having are normal. So I think that it was a good opportunity to lead through a crisis. The other thing it for me anyway, it really helped me to understand the need of basically bringing more people in to help, right? This wasn't a problem that I had to solve. It was a problem that we were faced with. It was something that I needed to deal with. And so in our case, I actually enlisted the help of basically the whole organization to deal with the crisis. So I think everybody felt like they were involved in helping us get through it, and they all played a role in it. And I think for us anyway, it turned out to be pretty successful.
Well, I was going to say, so one of the things we do is we watch, obviously, our community very closely. And I did notice not only did Bolt take this crisis seriously, you also stepped up in a very aggressive way to help. I see that you guys created these modular intensive care units for assisting with the COVID 19 um, pandemic. So, how did that idea come to fruition? And then, what kind of impact are you seeing from the fact that you guys actually did this and did it very quickly?
Well, I think from outward appearances and the community's perspective, this is probably some new type of process that we've come up with. It really is kind of a natural progression of what we've been doing. So for about the last 10 to 15 years, we've been acutely aware of some of the challenges that we've been facing in the construction industry with, a loss of a lot of the skilled labor that we used to have within the construction industry, as well as a reduction in the number of craftsmen that we have in order to accomplish our work. So on a lot of our bigger projects, for example, the large hospital project that we had downtown in San Francisco, we began exploring how we can use prefabrication to, one, maintain the quality of the finished product, and two, to reduce actually the number of workers that we would have on the job site. Constructing a project in the middle of downtown San Francisco causes you to look at things differently than when we're building a hospital in rural Wisconsin. We don't have the laydown areas, and we need to have just-in-time deliveries. So on some of the more complex assemblies that we have in the project, we were actually prefabricating them off-site, and then we would ship them onto the project, and we'd install them with fewer people while still maintaining the quality. So we began to think about how we would take that same process back into how we do our everyday work. And we probably about 2 years ago, we established a prefabrication facility here in Appleton, Wisconsin. And for about the last year and a half, all the projects that we've worked on, we've fabricated all of the exterior wall panels and many of the interior wall panels here in a warehouse environment, put them on a truck, and we would send them out to the job site where we would erect them in less time. Well, we've got a rather large healthcare customer down in Chicago that began looking at what we were doing and had asked us the question, do you think that we could prefabricate a healthcare clinic, kind of a neighborhood healthcare clinic? Instead of stick building it on site, would it be possible to build it in a warehouse, put it on a truck, send it out to the job site, and just erect it? It would cut down on the amount of traffic that we had in the particular area, would reduce the number of workers that were required to put it together. So shortly before the COVID virus incident or the crisis happened, probably about the first of the year, we actually built a prototype. It was a full mock-up of a section or a module within a clinic. And we built that so we could understand, the type of stresses that the module would undergo when we shipped it from Appleton down to Chicago. So we built this unit, we put it on a semi-truck, we drove it around the city, and just happened to have that sitting on our shop floor when this whole COVID crisis hit. I remember talking to some of our folks down in Chicago, and they were talking about the emergency testing facilities that they were putting in place for Advocate Aurora Hospital Group, and some of the work that we were talking to Freighted about. And I began thinking about what we were doing here in Appleton, Wisconsin, to deal with temporary testing facilities and where there might be an opportunity. So I just got done walking through our manufacturing facility, and then happened to walk through this prototype that we had built. And I brought our business development director in, Stacy. I said, Stacy, we've got this prototype of a facility here. We're manufacturing these modules. Maybe there's a way that we can manufacture these things to provide temporary facilities for this COVID virus. I said, why don't you see if you can get together with Ben, and maybe we can get a hold of ThedaCare and find out maybe if there's a need there. Well, Stacy went and talked to Ben. One thing led to another. We got a hold of HGA. We did end up talking to ThedaCare. We talked to some folks from Freighted Hospital. We talked to some folks from Advocate Aurora. We began talking to clinicians about what the need would be for this COVID virus. And we began talking about the fact that what they really needed to have were isolation rooms, basically intensive care units that they could put patients in that would have a negative air pressure that would not only treat the patient, but also to keep the staff safe. And that the only thing that many of the local hospitals had were the ICU units, and we had very short supply of those in this particular area. So they began brainstorming a little bit, and out of that came this StatMod project. We began talking to a lot of the healthcare facilities, and we ended up finding a customer out in Maryland that immediately saw the value of what we were dealing with. and put in an order for 3 or 4 of these units, of which we're currently assembling and putting in place today. So I think this all came about of one is trying to figure out how we might help in a situation like this, how we can take what we do as a profession to try to help everybody with it. And what we came up with is the stat mods. If I can put a little bit of a plug in for these things, it was absolutely fabulous. Now, if you consider that from the time we came up with the concept to the time we delivered the first unit was 5 weeks. And none of the members could meet face to face in order to develop this concept. So everything that we did was done through electronic means and leveraging technology. We brought teams together on FaceTime. We brought them together on Microsoft Teams and on Zoom, and they worked together collaboratively, come up with this project, this process. And 5 weeks later, we're delivering our first unit. Was absolutely amazing.
It really is amazing, and I have to say thank you. Just knowing how that has impacted the virus and the help that the healthcare professionals have been able. I mean, it's amazing, and you guys deserve tremendous kudos for being able to do that in such a short amount of time. So thank you. That's all. But we're going to talk about COVID though, because I promised you we wouldn't make it about that. So 150 plus years. I remember you having your 150-year anniversary of Boldt Construction. And, obviously as time goes on and leadership change, so doesn't the direction and the culture of a company. So I'm curious, how is Dave Kievet going to leave his leadership stamp at Boldt when you are all done with your career? What would you want people to say about the culture and direction um, you've presented at Boldt and your leadership as a whole?
Well, I've got a couple of goals that I want to accomplish here at the Boldt Company. One of my first goals is, and this is going to sound kind of funny, but one of my goals is that when I retire from the organization, I want to leave without anybody knowing that I'm gone, right? So by that, what I mean is I do believe in a decentralized leadership model. I think a distributed leadership where we're basically playing zone defense, that we all have our lanes that we are responsible for. I think we need to work as a team in order to get it accomplished, and we all share the responsibility in doing that. So that's one of my first goals. But I've actually done a lot of thinking about this. I've been a lifelong resident of Wisconsin and have always, even when I was a little kid, I knew about the Boldt Company, being interested in engineering and construction, and I had always admired them. So when I started to work for the Boldt Company back in 1990, I was really proud to do so. Now that I'm in the position that I'm in today, and knowing that I started basically as a field engineer and I ended up where I am today, I'm truly humbled about what I've been able to accomplish. As I think back at my career here at the Boldt Company, there's a couple memorable events that happened to me. And I remember I was running our Wisconsin River Valley office over in Stevens Point, and we were doing about $45 million a year. And I was getting a little bit, I don't want to say frustrated, but I wanted to do more. And I thought that just doing $45 million a year wasn't enough. And so I thought about leaving the organization. And I vividly remember a day I had a conversation with Bob the cook. Told him about my frustrations and that I didn't know if I could accomplish my career goals here at the Boldt Company anymore, because I wanted to do some bigger and greater things. And I remember Bob looking at me and saying, well, whoever told you that you couldn't accomplish those from where you're at? And that was actually an epiphany for me at that particular moment, because I realized right then that the success of my career had more to do with what I was going to do than it had to do with what the company was going to do for me. That I needed to be the driver, and I needed to take responsibility for what was happening in my career and the things that I was going to do. And I think it was really a turning point for me in what I was doing. And so I will say that the one thing that I've always valued about the Boldt organization, at least in my career, is I believe that they provided me the opportunity to, fulfill what it was that I was supposed to do. They allowed me to rise, to I guess, achieve whatever it was that I was supposed to do. They allowed me that opportunity. It wasn't so much that they did it for me, but they gave me the opportunity. So as I was thinking about that, I was reminded of a story about Oscar and Pat back in, 1950 or whenever it was, that Oscar actually took the Boldt company over from his father. And I remember a story about Oscar and Pat walking down a road on Lawrence University that just happens to be named Boldt Way today. And they were contemplating why they wanted to take over the business from Oscar's father. And Oscar had just gotten out of engineering school from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And what was he going to do with his career? And they made the decision that they were going to take over the business. And the reason that they were going to take over the businesses was to help people. So when I reflect on that, it was Oscar's vision that he got into the construction business not to build the biggest buildings in the state or to be the largest construction company in the state, but what he really wanted to do is be an organization that helped people to create their futures and helped to create an environment that allowed people to achieve their full potential. I think that fit in very well with me and what I've been allowed to do at the Boldt organization. So as I think about that, I think that that's my goal, is to continue on that legacy that Oscar built, to create an environment that helps people to achieve their fullest potential. I don't think that we're going to be an organization that necessarily is going to strive to build the biggest buildings or to be the largest construction company, but we do want to we want to create an environment where we can allow people, that allows everybody, I guess, to reach their full potential. And I think I've got a belief that if we do that, then I think by a natural occurrence, then we'll achieve some of those goals as far as size and volume that we need in order to keep a sustained growth for this organization.
Well, and it's very admirable. We don't hear that a lot, not just in construction, but in a lot of industries where it's really focused on the people and not focused necessarily on profits or revenue, which obviously we all need to make money. But it's admirable what Oscar and Pat built, and obviously what you're leading today. And Dave, it's really clear you've been very successful. You started as field engineer and you're chief operating officer of the company. But when you look back on your career, is there any one success that when at the end of the day, you hang your hat on and say, I just am so happy I was a part of that, or I'm so happy that we were able to accomplish that? Is there one thing that is your biggest success?
Well, one, like I said before, I'm very humbled to be in the position that I'm in. From where I started to where I ended up, um, I'd like to think I've got a little bit of talent. I probably had more to do with luck than anything. Um, but probably as I look back over my career, I've been fortunate to be involved with some of the largest projects I think that we've had in the company. Probably my biggest success would have been going from Stevens Point, Wisconsin, out to San Francisco, California, selling, one of the largest projects in the country at that time. It was about a $1.5 billion hospital project. Being able to convince, companies such as Sutter Health to take a gamble on the Boldt Company, in particular on Dave Kievet, that I was going to be able to successfully deliver their project using an innovative delivery method, and then being able to build just what I happen to think is probably one of the best teams in the industry that came together and actually accomplished that goal. That was very rewarding to not only be involved with it, but to be able to figure out and strategize how we were going to accomplish that, and then put together a team that I considered to be very high performing in order to accomplish that task. It was certainly of size and magnitude I wasn't going to be able to get done by myself, and being able to see some of the successes and what some of those individuals in that were involved in that project, what they went on to accomplish in their careers, has been truly rewarding.
Yeah, that was an amazing project. So I love to ask this question of all leaders because it's just an interesting way to look at what you're learning. So you've only been in your COO role for a couple years now, and I remember the interview where they asked President Obama after his first 100 days in office, what was your biggest surprise? And what he had said was, I didn't realize that by the time the problems actually got to my desk, they were of national concern. I was used to being able to solve problems, but these problems are a much different magnitude. The low hanging fruit is already gone by the time it gets to me. So, what has been your biggest surprise moving into the COO role? What's been your biggest surprise that you really didn't anticipate, but is something that you've had to either deal with or that has just sort of been an aha moment for you?
Sure. Well, I think that probably the biggest surprise was the gravity of the position. I think that I've always been an individual that has taken full responsibility for whatever I was working with. So when I was running projects, I always viewed that as my responsibility for the success of that project, and I would do what I had to do to make that happen. When I moved up and managed an office, this may sound a little bit funny, but I would look at the fact that I had at that time, I had 25 salaried individuals that were reporting to me and probably another 50 persons. And so I always looked at that. They had 75 families that were depending on me to make the correct decisions and to do what I needed to do to make the business successful so that they could live a fulfilling life. When I moved up from managing a small area office to a larger office in San Francisco, that number grew from 75 to 250. And then when I managed a regional, that moved from 250 up to 500. But still always had that belief and that philosophy that it was my responsibility to make sure that I was providing the best leadership I could because these families were dependent on me to do so. So moving from running a regional office now to stepping into the position that I am right now, I've got 2,500 families that are depending on me to make the right decision. And I guess I didn't quite anticipate the magnitude of what that would feel like, especially sitting and having to deal with some of the more complex problems that we have to get through. That was, I'd always prep myself of wanting to make the next step and make the next step and make the next step. And then all of a sudden I had that, and understanding what the feeling of that responsibility felt like was a little bit of an overwhelming feeling for me for a little while.
So, one of the things I've often said, if I could have a magic wand and I could offer every leader one thing, it would be a get out of jail free card. One card that you could do anything over you wanted in your career, anything at Boldt. So, if I gave you a do over card, what would you use it on?
Well, I probably, if I could do it all over, I think I would have probably come to the realization that this is more about building people than it is about building the projects that we're on. Um, I went through a rather difficult time, both personally and professionally, as far as coming to the understanding that this is really a people business. I think any business that you might be manufacturing widgets and at a certain level, it's going to be all about the people that are manufacturing those widgets. And in understanding that, I might have went back and focused a little bit more on the humanities side of my education as opposed to the pragmatic engineering side, and understanding about the human nature and how to deal with all that better than I did. It probably would have saved me a lot of headaches over the years.
Well, I have to tell you, I've known you for a long time, and I don't think you're giving yourself credit on what a great people leader you really are. So, one of the things I love about your mind as well is you're very strategic. And I do think that you've had some great insight, much like the ability to jump into the COVID and make an impact quickly. How do you see the changing landscape of the construction industry? Are there any insights on big changes that you see moving forward that maybe our listeners can be thoughtful of even the changing landscape of business?
I think in our business, and in construction itself, I've got probably 10 years left in my career. Um, and I think one of the biggest challenges that I'm going to face for the next 10 years is how do we deal with some of the labor shortages. So as a strategy, our complete focus is going to be how do we attract, how do we retain, and how do we grow the best leaders in the construction industry. I think that that's what's really going to matter. And then how do we accomplish more with less? So when we take a look at the stat mods that we're doing in response to the COVID-19 virus, It's that whole prefabrication effort as to how can we actually build the same volume of work but using fewer people while maintaining the level of quality in the projects. So I think we're going to have to rethink how we do business with prefabrication. I also think that we're going to have to take a look at what technology is out there in the marketplace, how we're going to leverage that in order to continue to provide a higher level of value to our customers. That's going to be our challenge.
Well, I think the talent and the interesting thing of the COVID is it did kind of stop very quickly our talent shortage, but I think it will also ramp up as quick as it stops. So it's going to be interesting to see once we are through this what's going to happen with talent. Um, I would be remiss if I don't talk to you about all of Dave, since we talked about it is not just the professional Dave, but also the personal Dave. I know you're a dad, and I know you are a husband, and as you said, a friend. So I would be remiss if I'm sure our listeners are listening to your trajectory and your career and wondering how in the world have you found balance? How are you balancing your personal and your professional life so that work doesn't completely consume everything about who you are?
Yeah, right now during the COVID virus, that's a big challenge. Um, I think that one of the cons or one of the negative sides of everybody working from home is I think that people having a difficulty stepping away. I mean, I think there is something um, naturally inherent with being able to take a break. If you go to the office, you're at work while you're there, and then when you get in your car and come home, it's a natural point to make a break. With everybody working from home, though, those lines have a tendency to get blurred. I see everybody working, earlier and working later, and I think that that's eventually going to catch up with everybody as well. But that whole work-life balance, I think, is extremely important. If you're not careful, it can consume you, and you need to find a way to get away. So I've got a little experience of doing this over the years, and I think that my years of travel, there were a lot of times when I would leave on Monday morning and I would come home on Friday, and I'd have the weekend to spend with my family. I'd get back on the road again on Monday and go away. It forced me basically to get into a routine. Is that Monday through Friday, I'm pretty much focused on my work, but the weekends, my wife and I have a cabin that's in northern Wisconsin, and it really is our place that we leave work behind on Friday. We try to just completely check out from what's going on at work, focus on family, focus on friends, and then on Monday morning, get back right back at it again, and then spend the time focusing in on what I need to do at work. So to answer your question, I think it's finding a way that you can compartmentalize the different parts of your life so that when you're at work and you're fully present. And when you're with your family, you're with your family and you're fully present in that particular moment, and you try to keep the two a little bit separated. That's worked for me anyway, and helped me keep my sanity.
I think that's great advice. I remember as a young girl, my father was a farmer, and I remember him always saying, make hay while the sun shines. And what I always thought is that meant when the sun was shining, he had to work. And really, what he was trying to tell me is there are moments in time where you have to really focus on the task at hand and get it done. And then there are times when you can take a break and just really relax. And I appreciate because I know you work a lot of hours, so I appreciate you sharing how you do find balance. And it's not necessarily working 40 hours a week. It might be working 60 hours a week, but when you're at work, you're very focused, and when you're home, you're focused on that. So I think that's great advice. So, advice for our young listeners. So, we've only got a little bit of time left. So, advice for our young listeners. People are all ages are listening to the podcast. If you were going to give advice to the younger Dave Kievet, or you were going to, just give advice to a young person asking you from a mentor perspective, what advice would you give them for their career moving forward?
So there's a couple pieces of advice that I would say is one is, again, I'll go back and say this is a people business. I know that there's a lot of people out there that are dealing with pragmatic aspects of their work, but in order to be a leader, you have to have people to follow you. And if you don't have people follow you, you're not a leader. And the only way that you can do that is through influence. And the way that you create influence is you have to create connections with people. So you're going to have to figure that out. You're going to have to figure out a way to connect with people. You're going to have to find a way to get things done through people, not just doing it yourself. I think that that's one of the biggest definitions, the differences, I guess, between a leader and a manager in my mind is the fact that in order to be a leader, you need to have followers. And how are you going to do that if you can't connect with the people? So one of my biggest pieces of advice is spend some time understanding humanities. It's probably one of my biggest criticisms of the education system, especially in the engineering schools, is the fact that they don't blend it with more liberal studies to understand how do we make those interconnections with individuals in order to get things done. So that would be the first thing. And then the second thing I think I would say is be careful what you ask for. There's some great sides of leadership, and everybody talks about the wonderful sides of it, right? The great things that come is, people that admire great leaders and the admiration and the praise that comes from leaders. I think the things that they don't talk about is the courage that it takes and some of the loneliness and the conviction that you need to have that you're doing the right things in the face of adversity, when everybody else is telling you that might not be the thing to do, but having enough conviction and faith and understanding of where things are going to hold the course. That can be a pretty lonely time. And nobody really talks about that. And if I were to say the difference between, great leaders and mediocre leaders, are the great leaders are the ones that have the ability to weather the tough times and come out on the other side of it. The mediocre leaders are the ones that kind of get caught up in the turmoil and get caught up in all the emotion that happens. So when I say that, be careful what you ask for, there are two sides of leadership, and they kind of go both hand in hand, when in reality, a lot of times all we talk about are the great things of leadership. So spend some time in understanding what that really means and what you're really getting yourself into, because there are good sides and bad sides to it.
That's such great advice. Plus, I think there's a book there, Dave, Courage Through Lonely Leadership. I'm starting to see in your future a book. So I don't want to give away any trade secrets, obviously, but I know you have dreams and aspirations for Boldt. So final question, anything that you can share with us that what can people expect to see out of Boldt Construction moving forward?
I think, as I think I told you before, my vision for the future is to focus on our people, right? I think that our success of the future is going to depend upon how well we're able to hire the best people, train the best people, inspire the best people, and then sit back and watch what they can do. So I think what we're going to become a much more employee-focused business, focused on the best employees, and in return, the best employees are going to provide the best service to our customers and provide the highest level of value. So I think what you'll see out of the Boldt organization is a whole lot of excitement. Want to reinvigorate that spirit of that entrepreneurial spirit that people are creating their lives. They're creating it for themselves. And I get really excited thinking about what our employees are actually going to do. I think that is really lies to the secret of what the future of Boldt looks like.
Well, Dave, I have to tell you, you are such an inspiration for me and for many leaders. And I just want to thank you for being willing to share so much of who you are. And we obviously wish Boldt nothing but tremendous success. And quite frankly, under your leadership, I absolutely am certain that we're going to see that. And thank you again for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sharon. Appreciate talking.